Welcome, and we're pleased to be here today. This is a continuation of our unit on individual leadership. We've been working on our resumes this week, and I've been reviewing your resumes, and they're a great tool for reflecting upon your own leadership attributes and style. Today we have a guest, a member of the outstanding teaching team we put together for this class, and I'd like to introduce Elizabeth Glassgow to you. And Ms. Glassgow, maybe you can just tell the class a little bit about your background.
Okay, I have an MSW, and my focus for my MSW is healthcare administration, policy, and planning. And I've worked in nursing home administration and management for about 20 years. Right now, I am a grant manager for several different state agencies and the Onset Prevention Fund for early childhood. And we're doing home visitation to improve maternal and child health outcomes. And so I am here today to talk about reflective leadership, which is a component of early childhood.
Well, we're very pleased to have Elizabeth here because Liz is really an expert on this concept of reflective leadership, how we look within at our leadership styles. And Liz has a ton of experience managing staff and running huge grants, and so it's really, we're going to be talking about that a bit. In the meantime, the exercise we're going to do is I'm going to be the guinea pig for the class, and Liz is going to really run me through an exercise of reflective leadership. And what we will then do is post the questions that Liz asked me in the discussion board, and you will then respond. You will see how I do it, and then I want your essays then to kind of respond to Liz's questions. So with that, maybe we can get started.
Okay, Professor Kling, I'd like to talk a little bit first about just reflective leadership and what is the reflective leadership. Really, the essence of leadership is to inspire and motivate, affect feelings and actions in others. And the way to get at that is really looking at yourself internally and your own attributes. And reflective leaders lead through relationships. And that's why this is a perfect time for you to be the guinea pig, because that's what the parallel process is watching you go through reflecting on your own leadership style. So self-awareness, careful observation of your own behaviors with others and with people you're trying to be a good, effective leader with is important. There's 4 areas we'll be going through. The first is thinking globally. Global leaders, successful leaders, think in terms of their community, not just themselves. So I'll ask you a series of questions just so you can reflect on your own thinking globally throughout your career and your leadership. So take a moment and just think about your own family and your own experiences growing up in your own family. And what were the values placed in thinking about issues related to social justice and experiences maybe you had that began to shape your worldview of the global issues beyond just your family?
Wow, that's a great question, and I'm fortunate in that regard. Reflecting back on growing up, my father was a professor of the history of India at the University of Illinois, and so as a young child, I actually lived in India for a year. And so that definitely shaped my understanding. Even though I was very, very young, I still have memories of that time. So I have an awareness, and I had an awareness at a very young age of kind of global issues. The social justice piece is really important to my family as well. So my father instilled in me, very young, the concept of social justice, and particularly I grew up in the '60s, and that was a time of so many of these social issues coming to the forefront. So I really have that instilled in me. At the same time, my mother is a social worker like you, and so she instilled in me the importance of the role of women in the workplace, the role of women in society, and I've always had a great respect for really women, in positions of authority and making progress and helping our community progress. So with both those things, I definitely have a lot of background that, upon reflection, makes me think that social justice and a global view is really critical to my thinking.
Well, in public health, really the underpinnings of public health is social justice. And so you had many experiences growing up that made you understand firsthand about social justice. So then, as you were going through college and earlier on in your career, what were some of the things that you read about, you learned about, you experienced that continued to inform your global view of public health?
Wow, that's a great question. I was lucky because another part of my lucky upbringing was that I went to the University of Colorado for college. And at the University of Colorado, there was a movement really around environmental justice. So social justice around environmental issues. The University of Colorado is a beautiful campus located in the mountains, and I really got a flavor for the mountains and nature and environmental issues. I really focused my college education. I have a bachelor's in economics, but I focused on environmental economics, and that was really as a result of my being there in the mountain setting. When I came back to Chicago for law school, I actually was a pioneer, a first one in the first class in a program of environmental and energy law at Chicago-Kent College of Law. And so again, really focused my law school education on environmental and energy issues, and actually have a certificate in environmental and energy law. And clearly there's a strong parallel linkage to environmental justice, social justice, and public health issues. So, awesome question, thanks.
Wow, those are two very sort of separate experiences, though, too, that really have informed your, global outlook. One is actually physically being in another country, and then the other of more the environment in which people live and how that affects their health and well-being. So, moving on to how do you see right now in your leadership those two separate experiences? How have they maybe informed your global outlook right now in public health, being a professor, and the law that you practice now? How are those two things? I'm sure you've had many other experiences, but those two, what right now is reminding you of your leadership in those two areas?
Well, I think that both of those experiences give me the ability to really work closely with a number of different types of students that come into my classes. As you know, I mean, my passion really right now is working with students, working with all of you. That's what I'm really, really engaged in. As I told my policy class last night, you are all really good people, or you wouldn't have chosen public health as a profession. You're a good person. You chose to get your master's in social work with a health administration focus. And so, really what I'm surrounded by are really good people that have a real passion for helping others. And so I think that those experiences in my life help me understand the value, values laden, of the importance of being socially conscious, of being fair, of equity, of looking at all different types of communities and listening carefully to the points of view of others. So I think all of those things inform me. I do really think that what's really cool that you just pointed out is this linkage between kind of the individual and people, and then their built environment, and how those interact, and we know that and how important that is in public health. So I think that's a really cool linkage right there. So thanks for pointing that out.
Well, we all come to our positions with a set of different circumstances and life experiences, including our education from early on, early childhood. And so in terms of that, we all come with very different backgrounds. So it's important just individually to look at what is in our own background, because it really does inform our global outlook. Many students come to graduate school having been out of the country, whereas some have never been out of their country. And some are coming from different countries to another country to study. And that informs us in our public health work. And so I wanted to just reflect for a moment on what it's like to be an administrator in our global outlook, or what it's like to be a manager in our global outlook, or our policy that we might be working on in leadership. And I'll give an example, my clinical specialty being early childhood development and the experiences women go through in pregnancy, and how it's very different all over the world. It's a very culture-bound concept, but there's many similarities. And so I've really reflected on my own knowledge of different communities within the state of Illinois or outside even the United States when I begin to inform policy related to early childhood issues. So I always keep in mind what are the experiences I've had globally, and what else do I hope to learn in my future to inform my own management and administration in early childhood policy. So in terms of thinking in your future, what are some of the things that you would like to think about globally related to public health that you hope would be in your future?
Wow, what a great question, because that's what I've been thinking a lot about. And I've talked to many of you individually, as you know, and this is one of the things that I want to emphasize is really focusing on an individual strategic plan. We'll be talking about organizational strategic plans in a couple of weeks. But right now, the concept of an individual strategic plan that I want you to have in the back of your mind. And in my own individual strategic plan for the upcoming years, I really do want to focus on a more kind of world view. I'm really interested in what's going on in the rest of the world. And what I want to do, what I want to focus on, is really take this discipline of analysis that I've built around analyzing the public health, public policy making infrastructure here in this country and locally and at the state level, and really kind of look at ways in which we can replicate some of the great pieces of the infrastructure we have in other countries. And so I clearly have a vision for how I want to take that global view and translate it, in the future for working within other countries and with other, cultures, to see if there's ways that we can build some policy infrastructure around public health. So
that's a fascinating concept.
Yeah.
Fascinating.
Neat.
Well, I could ask you 10 more questions about thinking globally, but I'm going to move on to the second topic.
Okay.
And the next topic is creating a vision. So individual, reflective, relationship-based leaders need to create a vision. That success is about developing, communicating, and strategically implementing a vision around that. And there's many different levels or ways to look at vision creating. And I always think about, in looking back and looking in the future, wondering, okay, what's the next new fad in creating a vision? Right now it's strategic planning. Everything is, let's make a strategic plan, let's make a logic model. But
Right.
Those are just words that describe this process of really evaluating a concept in public health or whatever the concept might be. Another might be looking at things in terms of levels. One of the things you could look at is looking very individually in one community, or you could look at a larger community system like Illinois, or you could look at the United States, or you could look at a global, but looking at that through the lens of different levels. The other thing that you can look at in creating a vision is, what is that vision for this month? Like maybe in a department where, like a public health department for maybe your communicable disease department, you're looking, what are the outcomes for that month? What are the outcomes for the quarter? What are the annual? What are we really envisioning here? It may be too looking 5 years from now, what do we want within our communicable disease department? What type of services do we envision providing within a community that helps people have access to and knowledge and improves the quality of their life? So in terms of creating a vision, tell me a little bit about what some of the experiences you've had related to public health in your career that have helped you create a vision, and it can be an example from any one of those, the different levels, a strategic plan, more looking at it in a time frame basis, whatever you choose.
Wow. Well, visioning has never been hard for me. That's one of my strengths as a leader, and one of my attributes is being able to come up with a vision. I seem to always be a little bit ahead of the curve in terms of some of the policy discussion, and I think some of that is just good fortune, and some of it is that I just have the ability to vision. And so that is something that I've thought a lot about. One of the things about my visioning, I think, is that I'm always conscious of having different levels, exactly as you described. So I always think about things at kind of a high policy making level at the 30,000 feet level, and then I think of the vision at the 3,000 feet level. What does it mean at the community base? And then at the 300 level, what does it mean upon implementation? And putting all three of those together, oftentimes what you run into, and what I've run into, and it's a career frustration of mine, is that I'll be sitting in meetings with people where the individuals may be really good at the 30,000 foot analysis, really good at the 3,000 foot analysis, or really good at the 300 foot analysis. And I think that what I'm really interested in is how you combine those to really make a vision reality. So that is really key to my approach as a leader. And as a perfect example of that was really how I got into public health in the first place. I worked in South Cook County. Some of you know that I worked in South Cook County, which is on the urban fringe of Chicago. And South Cook County looks a lot like the urban core of Chicago, except they're different communities that sit upon the urban fringe. And I was fortunate enough to work with a number of school districts down in South Cook County that sit on the urban fringe. And the children in these school districts are predominantly African American, many of whom live in poverty, many of whom have those risk factors and issues that really we look at each and every day in public health. And so I really got a taste at the 300-foot level going into these schools, talking to these kids every day about the issues they face. I translated that then into a 30,000-foot policy and created a governmental entity of my own called the South Cook Education Consortium. And the concept, the vision around the South Cook Education Consortium, and the vision that I carry with me every day as I've translated kind of public education policy into public health policy, the vision that I keep in front of me every day is this concept of the whole child. That's key to my vision. It's looking at the child when he wakes up in the morning and what he or she is having for breakfast, how they're getting to school, what they're learning during the school day, what's happening to them after school, what they're doing as they grow, when they get into high school, what kind of after-school activities, non-structured activities are they engaged in, What kind of workforce development opportunities do they have? So I kind of look at this whole child and look at, really the health implications of looking at that child. So that's really an overarching vision that I keep in my head all the time.
So one of the things I'm hearing you say is not only that you have a vision from all of the different levels, but you're able to communicate it. I really could understand what you were saying, envisioning a child waking up in the morning, their after school needs. Those are very clear ways that you're communicating that. And that's a really important thing as a leader. In your vision is you have to be able to tell someone about your vision, and you have to tell the average individual who knows nothing about maybe community schools, things like that, but you also have to tell policymakers and legislators and maybe school districts and all of those different constituents who are involved in that particular issue or public health issue. So can you give us some tips of maybe things you've learned about communicating your vision to others?
I can. And I think that one of the things to do is really to do an assessment, and this is what we'll be talking about as we enter the relationship management component of the course, because it's really assessing who it is you're talking to, knowing your audience. There's nothing more frustrating than being in a setting where the person is talking at a level that's either too high or too low, or without any kind of knowledge or any thinking about the audience that they're speaking with. It's interesting you mentioned some of the stakeholders and some of the other impacted individuals that you might talk to about this. One of the groups that comes to my mind is the researchers. And one of the things that I've been really about for the last 15 years or so is taking the information that the researchers that they collect, really hardcore research. And oftentimes those researchers don't have the greatest capacity to communicate that. And so what I do is act as a kind of intermediary, or what I've been calling lately really a translator. I translate that research, simplify it to the point of being able to communicate that to policymakers, to community. And one of the keys is to be able to do that quickly, effectively, and with that kind of emotive, where you catch the person's attention that you're talking to. I mean, it's about really having a proactive message. I talk about that a lot. Really having a creative and innovative theme. Really talking about solution-based. I think that's one of the other things that so often happens, is that you sit and I call it the whining syndrome. And I know you've been in many, many meetings like I have, where people sit around the table and whine. And I don't think that's productive. I think what we need to do is come up with creative, proactive, innovative solutions, and then go to the various stakeholders and say, here's a concept for you. An example of that, and I taught to some of my students that have had me before know about this, but an excellent example is one that I mentioned in my policy course this week. So some of you may be hearing this for the second time, but it's a concept that I had, a vision that I had, and again, it's related to the whole child, the overarching vision that most of my work is engaged in. This was the creation of what was called the YEA Corps, Y-E-A, the YEA Corps. And the YEA Corps, YEA stands for Youth Emergency Ambassadors. And the concept was, how could we take high-risk youth, high school-aged youth, and really pull out some of those youth that have a kernel of interest in preparedness and emergency preparedness in their community in general, and say, okay, become a member of this YEA Corps, C-O-R-P-S. So it's Y-E-A-C-O-R-P-S, YEA Corps. And how can you become a member of this corps, almost like a Peace Corps, except this is the Yay Corps. And the concept was to identify potential youth leaders, and run them through a curriculum where they learn about emergency preparedness. And they may get high school credit, they may get college credit, they may get a certificate. But the other value of it is they take those skills and then map their own community. And so they become engaged in their own community and really start looking at, hey, I can be a leader in this community. So it's really translating this concept of emergency preparedness, taking this one, which is a very complicated and complex policy issue, and taking a little piece of that and saying, how can we engage our youth as part of our emergency preparedness teams, and then putting a very kind of practical side on that. How can we pay these youth for the work that they're going to do in the community for mapping? How can we make sure they get some credit? How can we get them to have a certificate? How can we make this a workforce development pathway? So that's that kind of practical, innovative way of looking at things. One other thing in terms of innovation that I often think of is that, as young people know how to use technology. It's natural, instinctively for them. It's just so different for us. And so, how can we implicate into programs the concept of innovation and technology around youth? Because if you look at that whole child or that whole youth, you're really looking at what their skill sets are inherent in them, some of which have to do with the use of technology. So that's just like one example.
Okay, those were excellent examples. I'm going to try to meld down into just a few what you just said. So
Okay.
You're saying that one of the communication tips would be to know your audience, know who you're talking to, and be able to translate whatever that is. If it's research, to be able to simply state back, this is what this means. The other thing would be the use of technology as an important communication tool, and how youth, many times we have to reevaluate how we're communicating with youth because they have excellent technology skills. Or I guess the transverse of that being that not all adults do, or except for those of us who are older, we may not be using some of the more innovative technology in our communication. I think that's a very important thing when you talk about being able to take what is now the buzzword being was evidence-based and translating that into practice. And good leaders with vision, must be able to do that. And that's being able to take maybe the knowledge of research is showing us that we need to be prepared for disaster, emergency, whatever that might be that the research has shown us, and then looking at a component of how you actually implement that and communicating it with the youth. I have another example that I'll use in terms of communication that I'll use from, I was a department head and had maybe a quite large staff, and what we started learning several years ago is the impact of perinatal depression on infant development and relationship development later on, and brain development. And so, I could bring in a stack of books that would cover this desk on how detrimental it is if a mother is depressed, the impact on development and the growth and the well-being of the child. Well, how do I take this entire desk full of research telling us that women who have perinatal depression have children who are severely impacted by that depression, to a team of mental health early childhood staff to have them go out into the community and do something about it. And I think being able to communicate with them, here's a summary in a few sentences of how detrimental it is, and here are the techniques that have been found effective in identifying women who have depression, talking with women about how to seek treatment, and then actually intervening in the infant-parent relationship around that. That's an important thing for me as a leader, was to have that vision of wanting children to grow up and be as healthy and well-developed and ready for life as they can be. But when there's the risk factor of perinatal depression, what is our role as mental health professionals? And so those are always things we need to keep in mind in our communication about the research and how we use different things, like you're saying, technology, in creating that vision and then making a difference. And then, of course, evaluating if we've made a difference. But that's a discussion for another time. Okay, let's move on now to the third concept, which is long-term change. Successful leaders are changing future generations, not just this generation. So in terms of thinking about generational public health, what are some of the things that you've experienced in your career, different concepts that you have seen through the lens of generational, that you think are really, have been a really something that you can be proud of as a leader in public health?
Wow. Well, clearly, when I start thinking generational, I always think about my own kids. And one of the things, that I'm very attuned to, just as I stated at the very beginning, my parents were always very cognizant of making sure that I had great life experience and global experience. And I'm intent on making sure that my own kids have the access to those experiences. One of the projects I've been working on, as you know, is childhood obesity prevention. I've been working with CLOC, the Consortium to Lower Obesity in Chicago Children, for many years, and other community-based organizations that really have a focus on preventing childhood obesity. It's a very complex issue. It starts with a very simple precept that, calories in, calories out. It's what you eat and how you exercise. And those are very easy concepts to understand. But then you fold on top of that all the complexities of the built environment, the access to healthy food, the school food, what's happening in our communities, that really it's a generational issue, because kids, have just been exposed to so many risk factors when it comes to their health, and particularly as it relates to childhood obesity. The reason why I know that is both anecdotal. I mean, you can walk out on the street and notice it, but the research and evidence base tells us that. We know that. The research is coming out really every day that demonstrates that there is an increase in childhood obesity. And then from a very practical perspective, why wouldn't there be, when, if you remember Super Size Me, which actually might be a good assignment for the class to watch Super Size Me, but I remember a part of that film where they surveyed children, and they knew by tenfold at least, the kids knew who Ronald McDonald was more than they knew who President Bush was. And I'll leave my political commentary to my policy class on that, but the main message there is children get inundated with these images of Ronald McDonald and other and other heroes of our day, that what they're doing is really promoting unhealthy lifestyle. So one of the things about generational is that, and directly related to my work, is this concept of how do we do with very young children? How do we change? How do we change our society? It's a difficult thing. It takes patience. It's generational. And it's also impacting the parents' understanding of where it is. We know from the data that parents are asked if they think that their child's overweight, and they say no. even when the child is overweight. It's a really interesting piece of the data that we have to focus on, because that becomes intergenerational at that point. One of the experiences that I'll always remember is I was, as part of my work on obesity prevention in hard-to-serve communities, I was involved in the setting up of a produce market on the south side of Chicago, in the hardest-to-serve neighborhood of Inglewood and Woodlawn and Washington Park. Very, very high poverty area, and we set up a little produce stand. And really the concept was, can we make this a viable business? And the generational piece was, we received some funding from the city of Chicago, some federal funding under the Youth Build program, which is a recent part of the stimulus package, that they really looked at how can we get youth employed. And it was so energizing. It was one of my favorite experiences to really work with youth that we had employed under the Youth Build program to work at the produce market. And class, I'll post some pictures of that experience on the website, and I think you've seen those pictures, Liz. And you know, just the smiles on the youth's face. And these are youth that so much of their life is set up for failure, and to give them some hope that there can be, you know, employment opportunities, that those employment opportunities can center around healthy lifestyle, it's a double whammy. So that was one of those experiences that I really think of in terms of long-term generational. Again, it comes back to the vision. And if you think about a strategic plan, you think of, you know, vision and mission and values and goals and objectives, and class will be talking about that in coming weeks. But you know, the vision is the whole child, and part of the implementation or part of the values of that whole child, as I mentioned earlier, is, you know, providing, you know, opportunities for them to succeed in life, and that means getting, you know, gainful employment. So that's an example that I can think of off the top of my head.
That's a great example. And it was interesting how you began with your own children and then reflected right away back to the experiences you had as a child, and really that is the intergenerational of what we're talking about. And then the obesity, where family eating is a cultural, families eat within the context of their family and what generations have eaten, and so changing that type of behavior is really is a long-term, takes a long time and takes generation after generation to budge at all in terms of public health behavior. And so how have you had the patience to endure some of those changes in public health that have either been long-term or very slow to change? Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I did want to just put one other footnote on the previous kind of example, and that is that one of the greatest moments was when I was able to introduce my own kids to the kids that were working in the Youth Build program, and really kind of show my own kids.
Ronald McDonald.
No, they've met Ronald McDonald before too. He's hard to avoid.
Right.
You know, that's the patience thing is a tough question, because I'm relatively new to public health, and I mean, what I can tell you is that you know, the patience comes from one of the things that we talk about in my policy course, that you know, changes in public policy are incremental. And so, you know, the patience is really knowing that, you know, looking at you know, how we're you know, amending state law to increase the comment period for parents to comment on a school district getting rid of a physical education program, even though that seems incremental. You have to have the patience to know that on a continuum, that leads to long-term systemic change. Sometimes you get lucky, and sometimes, you know, you are able to do kind of monumental change pretty quickly. But so much work in the policy and public health policy arena, you know, does require patience because it takes so long. So I always try and remember, change is incremental. Change is really, community by community, and that's why, again, I talk about really impacting public health at the community-based level. I mean, that's certainly not my concept. That's the concept of public health, is really community-based. And so that helps me maintain my patients, going out to the community and seeing change. Seeing a great example is and I worked a little bit on this, but really the concept of these closing off the parkways on Sunday for bicycling in the city. I mean, that the mayor actually made this happen, where the large parks in the city of Chicago are closed down, and the roads around the large parks are closed down on the weekend, so families can go on bike rides, and it's working. It's not like pie in the sky. I mean, it's working. So I think the key, back to your question, is really to look at change as being incremental and just being patient. And again, I'm relatively new to it, so maybe you'll ask me that again in 20 years, and I'll probably be a little bit more cynical about it.
Okay, so change is incremental. That's a great concept, though. And the other thing that I really noticed in what you said is how it's incremental, but you also mentioned very realistic small changes, like a park. That's one change, whereas many times, I was kind of thinking in my head, how do you weight those generational changes out around some of the bigger topics like smoking, where, when our generation was growing up, people smoked in homes, everybody smoked. You smoked at the doctor's office, or you smoked in a car with the windows up. And now, the generation today knows so much better, and public smoking is banned, and there's been a lot of really large changes, but it's taken many generations to change that, and it's not completely stopped. But you pointing out that it's incremental and it's other changes to look around for. So how obesity prevention maybe, or obesity rates, how to look not just at, okay, the overall rate now is 25% and we need it to be 15, but looking at some of those other policy issues or practice issues. Those are some really good tips and points and things to think about in public health leadership. Okay, let's move on to our last topic, which is cultural competence. Successful leaders assure individuals and systems respond respectfully and effectively. So in terms of cultural competence, and every time I hear the word cultural competence, I think about my students from the MSW program who moan and groan every time there's an assignment on cultural competence. And several of them have said to me, I know all about it. If I have to hear one more thing about cultural competence, I'm going to scream. Or I think we've beaten it to death in our society and in our education institutions at all levels. But what I know now that I didn't know when I was in graduate school is this is the hardest concept. I think I know less now about being culturally competent than I knew 10 years ago, 20 years ago, because it's so hard to really get a handle on what does it really mean as a leader to be culturally competent. What does it really mean as a decision maker to be culturally competent? So in terms of your cultural competence, can you give us examples in your leadership, or really just think about what are some things that have influenced your own cultural competency as a leader?
Wow. Well, I think that some of it reflects back to that first question, that I was fortunate enough to live in other cultures as a very young person, and I also was really introduced to the concept of the important role, say, that women play, and then the other piece is, I am of Jewish heritage, and I grew up in a small town, and so that concept of being kind of the token Jew, if you will, in the group of Gentiles was kind of a very important part of how I kind of think about how I empathize and how I reflect upon others, others culturally. Clearly, teaching in this program has provided me just a window into cultural competence, because the strength of the University of Illinois Chicago School of Public Health, as I think you know, is we really have an amazing diversity of students. So I have had to really adjust a little bit, just to I mean, sometimes the language barriers can be challenging. Sometimes the cultural barriers can be challenging. And so you constantly have to be aware of that. And that's kind of the global perspective. Bringing it more kind of locally, I really believe that what you've demonstrated today is absolutely key to a great, competent approach to understanding different cultures, and that's the ability to listen. You are an amazing listener, and so when people go, it's one of those other things that kind of drives me crazy. When you go into a community meeting in the heart of the hood, and all these white people are standing up talking about obesity prevention. They're standing up at a podium, and the community people are, sitting in the chairs or at tables, and there's just an uncomfort for me there. I mean, I think the real key is to really, listen to what the community is telling you, and I have very tangible examples of that from my own work. But a tangible example from really something that's very crisply in the news today is this concept where the chief of police and other city leaders sat down with gang leaders to try and negotiate some strategies around nonviolence. And it's a very, very complicated issue. It's a risk. I mean, and we talk about good leaders taking risks. That's a risk as a political leader or as a police leader to go and sit down with gang leaders. But the ability to, I think about it, and as I've been hearing the story, I've been thinking about it in terms of cultural competency. No matter what, at the least, they were able to sit down and look at each other in the eye and understand each other in a very personal, environment, one-on-one or in a small group. And no matter what, that helps. No matter what, when you sit across from somebody at a table, it has an impact. And so I think about that story as really a kind of example of how we integrate cultural competence into our policy making and into our community capacity building. I mean, I look at that, the police chief of Chicago sitting down with gang leaders. And of course, the armchair quarterbacks, the hindsight being 2020 people on both sides. I heard people complain from the policing community about it. I heard ex-gang members complain about this meeting that took place. I've heard complaints from everybody, and it gets back to the point that I made previously. It's really easy to complain about stuff. It's really easy to find, negativity and to, find things that you can criticize in situations, and particularly as they relate to community. But I always try and find that really positive piece of, that interaction. And I think that's part of being, culturally competent, is really being able to look at each situation and find that positive element. Mm-hmm. And that's a perfect example of that. Mm-hmm. I have other examples. I mean, it's when you go into particularly African American communities, Latino communities in Chicago, you have to you have to be aware of what the expectations are, what the community is looking at you like. For instance, I'll give you a perfect example, Liz. I always wear a suit some of my students know that. I always wear a suit when I go to meetings in the community. I do it out of respect for the fact that I'm going to a meeting in the community. It's part of my preparation for that type of meeting. Some people, and it's a style thing, some people may say, I don't wear a suit because I want to blend in and I want them to feel that I'm that I'm an equal, But my approach as a leader is to really, my feeling is when I wear a suit and I come, they know that I'm about, working with them. I'm serious about working with them. I have prepared for the meeting, and it's just kind of one of the elements of how I do it. It's a more formal approach to, really interacting. So that's an example of how, I try and, just at least am aware. Now, whether it's right or wrong, that's something that I guess, different people are going to have different opinions on.
But I think in terms of reflecting on your own leadership, that's key what you just said, is it right or wrong? It's not about being right or wrong. It's about you being able to planfully and very clearly articulate your thinking and behavior that has gone into the things that you're doing as a professional. And that's what it's about. I mean, we could spend hours talking about what is and isn't culturally competent, but where you always begin is, and where you began today, I think just naturally, is looking at how you were raised and who you are, because that is the mirror we use with others. Once you understand that, you're able to become more culturally competent, because you begin to recognize your own potential bias, your own experiences, and how that is shaping you professionally. And so for you then to say, okay, and here's the things that I do, here are the ways I believe, that's all cultural competency is. And so in terms of rights or wrongs, generally there's not, but you've pointed out some really important things, and that's your ability to begin with where you are, your ability to articulate planfully why you're doing the things you do, and as well as you just pointing out the importance of being a good listener, because you need to be able to receive the information that others are telling you, whether it's receiving it out in the community, whether it's receiving it one-on-one from someone, wherever that information is coming from. It helps inform you as a professional, and cultural competency is about being planful. So
Yeah.
those were really excellent examples, and very reflective on your own competence professionally.
And it is about reflecting. I mean, this is all of the units in this course, and how I've designed the course to kind of start with the individual, move to the relationship, and move to the community, and then to kind of the nation state, and then into the global worldview. Many of that concept was really, I think you drove home today in many of your comments and your approach, and I think that's really helpful. But this is so key, to be able to reflect upon yourself and your own leadership style. I do a lot of that. It's sometimes painful. You have to know your limitations. You have to know what you're not good at. And I think that's as important as knowing what you are good at. So it's refreshing to kind of sit down and really kind of reflect. And so much of that it's a perfect segue, really, that last question, because what we're going to be doing when we move into the relationship management unit of the course is really start looking at how you, through discipline of thought, how you do a kind of assessment of the person that you're sitting across from, a kind of rapid leadership assessment of what the person looks like. Some of the characteristics are objective, and some are very subjective. And how do we kind of put those, encapsulate that quickly, and have that be part of the interaction? So that's a great segue into kind of our relationship management unit. So and again, it gets back to that quote. Maybe you can repeat that quote. What's your quote about reflective leaders lead through relationships?
Lead through relationships.
Yeah. Reflective leaders lead through relationships.
Through relationships. And it's what you're saying right now, that you begin to reflect on yourself and you understand yourself. And when you're sitting across from someone, the importance of the relationship that you have with those around you, whether it be your staff, sometimes you're the supervisor's supervisor, or you're working with other policy individuals sitting around a table coming up with public health policy, that it's all about the relationship and that it's a parallel process. So how you are with others is how they'll be with others. So when you leave that conference table, how you were with people at that conference table is how you want them to go and be out in the community and with others. And it's not easy stuff. Many times in public health, we might be right, but we may not be effective. And so we need to remember that.
Yeah, that's a great thing to remember, because the concept is effectuating positive change. One of my students this week in the policy course used the example of getting rid of vending machines in schools, and it's a great example because it seems like a logical thing to do. It seems like a great public policy, but as public health professionals, we have to kind of step back and think about what that means from a management and organizational perspective, what it means from an evidence-based and data-driven perspective. Does it really make a difference to yank vending machines out of school? From a cultural competency perspective, we know that if we yank the vending machines out, kids,
someone may not eat that day.
That's a good point. Someone may not eat that day, or the other example is that it creates this kind of underground marketplace of candy and pop. Somebody brings their kids are bringing duffel bags full of of forbidden materials into school to sell. I mean, it's created this underground marketplace. Now, it may be a good thing in terms of the person doing that can make a little bit of money off that. But the concept, I mean, overall is when we make these policy decisions, they may seem like a good idea because, as I said at the very beginning, we're in this business because we are passionate about kids and we are passionate about the world around us, and people that are in a master's program in public health are good people, naturally, but is it an effective policy or is it an effective change? So that's really cool. So that's awesome.
Well, thank you for going through your own self-reflective activity today.
Well, thank you for leading me through. It's not easy to do.
No, it's not
and
easy.
All of you now, what we're going to do, Ada and I will post on the website, probably either in the assignment section or in the group discussion board. Ada will figure it out and help us decide. We'll post this one sheet of paper that says individual leadership that has the 4 questions that Liz posed to me, and what I will ask you to do is write an essay on those 4 questions. And so remember that we have 2 components of this week's unit. One is an all-class discussion board, and I really am interested, and Liz will track some of the comments as well. I'm interested in hearing what you have to say about this conversation. And then the individual assignment for the week is to take these 4 questions and write an essay reflecting on yourself and kind of thinking as if Liz was asking you the question she asked me. So with that, we're going to wrap it up for the day, and we'll talk to you all soon. Thank you.